Hello everyone. Welcome to my presentation, Can't See the Forest for the Trees, Making Sense of the Literature Review Landscape. The explosion of scientific information aligning with evidence-informed practice initiatives has created the need to systematically gather and synthesize evidence in order to provide recommendations for clinicians as well as for policy and decision makers. However, pertinent questions can also be raised about this evidence through critical discursive reviews, which problematize assumptions about knowledge and truth. Questions and tensions can subsequently arise as to how to choose the best approach for reviewing the literature. How does a beginning researcher choose the best literature review methodology? While there are numerous resources that outline the various approaches, the purpose of this discussion is to apply a philosophical lens to the process of thinking about literature reviews. Thus, the focus of this discussion is to analyze the literature review landscape while keeping in view a philosophical inquiry stance related to discussing the underpinnings, assumptions, and philosophical tools that one can use to choose an appropriate literature review approach. I will compare and contrast two reviews that I have been conducting or have conducted, a Joanna Briggs Institute systematic review and a critical discursive analysis, in order to examine how differences in purpose can influence choices for a literature review. So just to give you a bit of background, I did originally create this presentation in the fall of 2014 as part of my dissertation seminar class at UVic for my PhD, and I was also preparing a qualitative systematic review presentation for a conference at UVic at the same time. And so this presentation was done in parallel to my presentation for that review. Essentially, they have the same information, although this one I felt was more applicable to an online audience because my PhD program was online and our seminars were online. So I've decided to share this one on my YouTube site instead. So these are the goals for the discussion. For me, these goals relate to larger questions related to knowledge, privilege, and the roles and goals of science and philosophy, as outlined on the debate on IAI TV, and that's part of my reference list. This debate is between a philosopher, a journalist, and a scientist who debate Hawking's claim that, quote, science has killed philosophy. It is a fabulously entertaining debate and offers much food for thought about science, philosophy, and the intertwining or separation of the two. So this discussion today is framed by a philosophical inquiry approach, and I'd like to quote two authors who are actually professors at the University of Victoria, and that is, philosophical inquiry does not lead one to a correct answer, but enables the articulation of various views of knowledge and therefore of nursing practice. So where am I in my understanding? A little bit of a background on where I am positioned in this discussion. In terms of literature reviews, I did a critical discursive review for my master's project in 2013. Then, in June of 2014, I obtained my certification as a Joanna Briggs Institute systematic reviewer, which is a particular methodological approach for conducting systematic reviews involving searching, appraising, and synthesizing literature. And the purpose of JBI reviews is to provide best evidence for practice and policy. And for me, these two types of literature review, a JBI review and a critical discursive review, have different purposes and are also based on certain philosophical assumptions. I had time to further reflect on these assumptions when I co-wrote a paper based on my MN project, which was rejected by an editor for failing to utilize a standardized, structured tool for assessing the quality of the literature in my review. I will discuss this a bit further in detail later in my presentation. So here we have a little bit about the numerous possibilities for the types of literature views that we have seen by reading authors such as Shik Makarov and her colleagues and Anastasia Maladou's paper that are in my reference list. I have at times felt quite overwhelmed when reading about the various approaches, wondering how I will ever understand them all. Hence, my next slide. Yes, sometimes it does help to just smile and nod my head. And I must admit this approach has worked at various points in my nursing education pathway so far. Sometimes when thinking about lit reviews, science, evidence, and philosophy, I have also felt a little out of place as I try to figure out what's what, if you will, sometimes feeling diagonally parked in a universe that is set up a certain way. And thus I feel sometimes it can be helpful to think out of the box, similar to the cheese photographer, and I find that utilizing philosophical means can aid in this process. However, like Stan the Bumblebee, I am finding that with respect to learning about lit reviews, it can minimize the overwhelming feelings by starting small, just picking or choosing one or two lit review approaches and beginning from there. So that is the approach I have taken, starting with two different methodological approaches to reviews, the JBI approach and a critical discursive approach, in order to explore the purposes and underpinnings of these types of review. What I found helpful in organizing my thoughts about lit reviews was to think about these dimensions or domains that have been outlined by various authors. These dimensions help to sort out the various lit review methodologies in terms of where they may predominantly sit along these various continuums of idealism, realism, iteration, theoretical and utilitarian outcome, or interpretive, integrative, or aggregative. So just like the picture of the jack, I see these areas as intersecting along various planes, and lit reviews as situated among these planes, depending on the assumptions from which the review evolves. For example, on the idealism-realism plane, a more realism-based lit review approach could be where the researcher sees the world as it is, tend not to alter a research question during the review process, and the primary research is not problematized. In terms of degree of iteration, for example, meta-study, thematic analysis, formal grounded theory, they are circular and highly iterative. Researchers often go back and forth, revise decisions and processes as the synthesis unfolds. Others are more highly structured approach, and there's certain protocol-driven steps in order to select, organize, and appraise the primary research. And the Joanna Briggs Institute would be more of an example of that. And outcomes, thematic synthesis, for example, JBI approach again is to inform practice or policy, so it's more of a utilitarian outcome. Middle range theory development, for example, formal grounded theory is more of a theoretical approach. And then along the interpretive aggregative domain, qualitative evidence synthesis includes all of these approaches, but one of these is usually more prominent. So, for example, a mainly aggregative type of review lists the findings of primary research, combines or pools them into themes, and produces a general description of a phenomenon, and it treats findings as if they are isolated from the context in which they occurred. And from my experience, my JBI approach would fit under more of an aggregative approach. Meta-summaries, thematic analysis, case surveys, content analysis, Bayesian meta-analysis, qualitative, comparative type of work. According to various authors, those approaches are more aggregative. Mainly interpretive approaches, they extend aggregation to produce a newer abstract model or theory that also considers the context. And many authors suggest that examples of more interpretive reviews include meta-studies, narrative synthesis, narrative summaries, formal grounded theory, and meta-ethnography. So where are my reviews situated? Well, like I've mentioned, I did have my JBI Qualitative Systematic Review Protocol published in July of 2015, and I have now completed my JBI Qualitative Systematic Review, and that is currently under peer review with JBI. And according to JBI, they do situate their reviews as an aggregative type of review. It's highly structured. There are certain expectations for the development of the protocol and step-by-step processes by which literature is searched, found, appraised, and then either included or excluded in terms of the protocol that you have written up. And although when you read JBI documentation, they talk about the process being less iterative, I would also argue from my experience that it is iterative, because certainly you are going back and forth between your preliminary searching and appraising and having discussions with your team. So I think my experience with it was definitely more iterative than what JBI would explain it in their documentation. And I think, going back to my previous slide, that's why I would say that it's not that the domains are mutually exclusive, but that there may be parts of the review process that may be more iterative, less iterative, more interpretive, more aggregative, and that it's important for researchers and students to really begin to think about some of these processes and what philosophies and assumptions underpin the various literature review methodologies that one may choose to use. And then the critical review, I had written an article based on my master's project, which was a critical discursive analysis of practical nurse discourses in Canada. And so I am co-author with my supervisor, and that was published, but we had an interesting experience with the process of publishing that piece, because the original editor rejected it because she was looking for a highly structured, systematic tool that was to be utilized to assess and appraise the quality of the literature in that discursive review. And in consultation with my supervisor, I decided to email the editor back and explain that I respectfully disagreed with her suggestion to use a standardized tool to evaluate the quality of papers for a discursive review, because I argued that this paper was coming from an interpretive philosophical paradigm which assumes discursively co-constructed knowledge, which is contestable, incomplete, and fallible. So it really is not supported by mechanisms which assume a standardized truth or a presumed goal of comprehensiveness or completeness of surveying the entire literature landscape. And so again, when people are situating your reviews, this was a good lesson for me in learning how the peer review process, editors and peer reviewers might be coming from a completely different philosophical space and perhaps don't understand the assumptions that are written into either explicitly or implicitly in your papers. And so we gave that feedback to the editor. We then submitted it to another journal, and it was successfully published. So in summary, I would say from my experiences is that a JBI systematic review and a critical discursive review are two different types of literature reviews with different purposes and different philosophical assumptions, and should have different criteria for assessment of value, quality, whatever types of conceptualization become significant for that type of review. So meta-aggregation, according to JBI, does have its roots in the Cochrane collaboration and pragmatism. It summarizes common and competing findings, produces cross-study generalizations, and the outcomes are for action, practical implications, best practices, policy development. So there is a balance of utility and complexity. And it focuses on processed data, findings, not interpretation of original data. And the methodology includes the development of a research question, inclusion-exclusion criteria, as well as a type of review, qualitative, quantitative, mixed methods, scoping. They have numerous different types of reviews that can be done. And so the philosophical underpinnings of JBI aggregates findings into a combined whole, does not seek reinterpretation. You are expected to do a systematic, transparent, exhaustive search of the literature, critically appraise the literature, extract the findings, create categories, and then synthesize the categories. The unit of analysis is findings, which are themes, metaphors, or concepts identified by the original research in the primary research articles. You can combine various qualitative approaches or methodologies within a qualitative systematic review, as JBI argues that each methodology is considered to be embedded within the findings rather than distinct from the findings. Thus, the philosophical perspective of the primary research is thus not lost in the synthesis process. And the JBI process is pragmatic, as its focus is to generate recommendations for policymakers and practitioners. And of course, my critical analysis of PN education was a critical discursive review, focused more on an idealism underpinning, which assumes multiple truths and that knowledge is fallible, contingent, and incomplete, and knowledge as discursively constructed. And it's also highly iterative, returning to the literature to further analyze and interpret, and thus highly interpretive as well. And like I mentioned earlier with my issues with publication, is that we're not really concerned with the quality of the literature in this context, as the purpose is not a complete, exhaustive review of the literature. However, just a review of what is currently said and not said within the literature. And literature could also include gray lit, research articles, and again, you just make that explicit within the paper. And so when I did have that experience with the editor who rejected the discursive review and felt there should have been a standardized approach to critical appraisal, I must admit I felt sort of like this, that really there was a predominant expectation that was sort of driving the bus, and that's why I talked it over with my supervisor and decided that I would write back to the editor and respectfully argue for why I did not take the approach that she was requesting. And we did resubmit, and interestingly, on the resubmission to a second journal, there were 2 peer reviewers, and one was very positive, and the other did suggest justification for the search strategy, the quality of the analysis, and they were concerned with different and contested philosophical concepts, and they were looking for a systematic discussion on the utility of the approach taken. So again, my initial reaction, I think this face basically sums it up. But then upon reflection, my supervisor actually suggested that I leave the feedback for a day or 2 and then revisit it when I could better balance the feedback in my mind. And she was absolutely right. When I reread the feedback later, I realized that the positive review was very encouraging and that one does not have to necessarily change everything that the reviewers suggest. So I drew up a chart where I reviewed and responded to each comment from each reviewer and noted what changes we did make and reasons why we did not make other changes, and we submitted, and it was published with the second journal. So, in summary, what did I learn throughout these various recent experiences, parallel or perhaps not so parallel? That really I needed to focus on the purpose of the lit review. Why might I be doing it? Why was I writing this lit review the way I was? And the dimensions of the underpinnings of the review. How do they fit together? How do they cohere? What literature is available? And it makes me think about where I want to be moving forward. One of the many red raspberries, or perhaps the blue raspberry. Or said another way, is there an assumption that certain lit review methodologies will prevail over lesser known or less popular, or those that don't fit the predominating paradigm? So I leave you with those thoughts and a question for all of us. Where do we want to be? Where do we want to situate ourselves as researchers? And this is just a summary of all the readings I did in preparation for my presentation, and just showing the larger systematic review landscape. And some authors suggest that some are more towards the interpretive domain and others are more towards the integrative or aggregative domain. And this is just an overview of each. However, they do need to be teased apart by those that are actually doing the reviews so that there is understanding and coherence in the review itself. So thanks for listening today, and if you have any feedback, please feel free to comment on this video. And here are my references for the videos and readings that were all part of this presentation today. Thanks for listening.